Hi everyone, today we're going to look at all of the Olympus OM-D 20 megapixel cameras. And we're going to start with the Olympus E-M10 Mark IV, then go to the E-M5 Mark III, then the E-M1 Mark II, and E-M1 Mark III, and finally the E-M1X. So what I'll be doing as we're discussing each camera is talking about the benefits and features that each model adds in the lineup. And then I'll be making recommendations of who I think this camera is best for. Just keep in mind that, these are my own opinions and your opinions and criteria may be different, but I tried to really touch on the key differences between this camera to help you make a decision. Here's a list of the cameras we'll be looking at today and the years that they were released, and you can see that most of them were released this year or last year, except for the EM1 Mark II, which was released late in 2016, but it's still a very relevant camera today, which you'll see as we go through each model. The E-M10 Mark IV is Olympus's entry-level camera into the OM-D system. But don't let entry-level fool you, because it's still a very, very capable camera, and it'll give you the same image quality as any other cameras we'll be looking at today at a very, very reasonable price. But what they've added this year basically is they've upgraded the sensor to the 20 megapixel sensor, just like in their flagship model. They've also improved the IBIS to 4.5 stops. It was previously 4 stops in the previous 2 generations. And they've also improved the contrast autofocusing system. So it is contrast detect only, but it now has all of the latest algorithms in it, particularly for face and eye detect. Another really kind of cool feature is they've now added the 180-degree flip-down screen, which used to be only available on their pen line. And basically what that is like on my pen here, what the older OMDs used to do is only tilt up, like so, or maybe tilt down about 45 degrees. Now you can tilt all the way down 180 degrees so that the screen is facing you. And this makes it a lot easier for doing selfies or for vlogging, things like that. So I think that's a really significant upgrade to the OM-D this year. And they've continued the 4K video from the previous, which was introduced in the Mark III, but they've added USB 2 charging. So what that means is you'll be using a micro USB jack and not the USB-C jack, the newer USB-C jacks. And that's not a big deal because we're just charging the camera or the battery in the camera. We're not doing any kind of data transfer or anything that would need a USB-C jack. So it's fine with the USB 2.0. So what are my recommendations here on this camera? Well, I think if you've been shooting with your cell phone or maybe a little compact camera like a pocket camera, this will be a really, really nice upgrade to using one of those. Because you'll have access to the entire lens lineup of the Olympus system or the Micro Four Thirds system from third party and from Panasonic. Tons more features and controls, so you can really expand your photography as far as you want to go. I used to use the E-M10 Mark II for my professional work, as a matter of fact. So this E-M10 Mark IV is really, really a nice camera. I also recommend it for people that may be thinking about upgrading their camera from an older Olympus camera. So if you have the E-M10 Mark I or the E-M5 Mark I, or you have one of the older pens like the Pen PL5, the 12 megapixel cameras, this would also be a really, really nice upgrade without spending a lot of money and getting into all of the other features that we'll talk about later. So I don't recommend this camera really if you have an E-M10 Mark II or an E-M5 Mark II, or if you have, say, the E-M10 Mark III. I don't think it's worth the extra $600 to $800 to buy this camera if you already have one of those, because the upgrades here are nice, but they're not $600 to $800 worth, in my opinion, in terms of upgrading. So again, really this is a good first camera as an entry-level camera into the OM-D system. Or as a nice upgrade if you have a much older Olympus camera. Now the E-M5 Mark III adds a lot of additional features over the E-M10 Mark IV. As you can see, I've listed here an improved IBIS system to 5.5 stops. And that's theoretically, that's twice as good as the E-M10 Mark IV. And then they've also improved the autofocusing system by including phase detect autofocus. So the autofocus will be much faster than it will be on the E-M10 Mark IV, particularly for like continuous autofocus and tracking. Also, the camera's weather sealed, so you can take this out like if it's raining. You don't have to worry about it getting wet. Assuming you have a weather sealed lens to go with it, this camera is generally very durable and rugged for outdoor use. It's not hardcore like the M1X, which we'll talk about later, but it is a well-built camera. It's still an all-plastic build, just like the M10 Mark IV, but it's a solid camera. This is really my first camera of choice when I go out on my vlogging and things like that. Uh, they've also added a custom mode on the mode dial. So you can quickly access a custom setting. Now the M10 Mark IV doesn't have any custom settings, but on the EM5 Mark III, they have one on the mode dial, and then you have access and you can program 2 more custom settings. So typically what I do is I'll set custom setting 1 as my normal shooting, aperture priority, continuous autofocus, natural color profile, etc. And then I'll save the additional 2 custom settings in the menu for maybe monochrome or maybe for bracketing. But this is something you cannot do on the M10 Mark IV. Also, we now have a fully articulating screen. So the screen now flips all the way around and out both ways. And that's, again, that's for video work and vlogging or selfies, things like that. And I know a lot of people for photography prefer just the tilt, and maybe even that 180 is still a better option, but with a fully articulating screen, you can get additional angles that you can't get with a tilt only. In particular, like if you're doing a portrait, you can kind of tilt the screen this way and look down at the camera, whereas you can't do that with the tilt screen. They've also added a mic jack. So if you're recording video, you can attach a wireless mic or a boom mic on top of the camera and get much, much better audio than you ever will with camera internal microphones like you do have on the EM10 Mark IV. They've also added Pro Capture mode, which is pre-buffers like 30 frames before you actually take the picture, and then once you start taking pictures, it'll buffer 30 frames per second in RAW. So that really makes easy work of, say, capturing butterflies at that right moment, right? As they're taking off or landing on a flower, which I've done before. Also, for birds in flight and hummingbirds, all kinds of uses for that. And now the M10 Mark IV has focus bracketing in camera, which is a great feature, but the M5 Mark III also adds focus stacking. So what it'll do is it'll actually merge those files back together to give you one image that has everything in focus. So if you're not familiar with focus bracketing and focus stacking, I have videos on that, but it's really nice to have that in camera, because on the M10 Mark IV, what you would have to do is take like 8 or 10 pictures and then go into Photoshop or post-processing software and process those and stack them back together. And the M5 Mark III lets you do that in camera. Another really nice feature is the M5 Mark III also has a high-res shot mode. So it'll give you up to an 80 megapixel RAW image or 50 megapixel JPEGs. So you can really get really nice images, very, very detailed images, assuming you have a pro lens or very good lens to go with it. And I use this feature time to time. It's not something I use a lot, but it is a nice feature. And on this camera, you'll need to do it on a tripod. So if you're on a tripod, you can shoot a high-res 80 megapixel image right in camera. They've also have 4K video, but not only is it 4K, but they have Cinema 4K, which gives you additional resolution and also has a much higher bit rate, more than double than what you get on the EM10 Mark IV. So what that means effectively is you'll get less blockiness in the camera and better image quality for your videos. And then finally, they have 120 frame per second 1080p video for slow motion type effects and things. So this is a lot of additions. Of course, the camera costs, $300–400 more depending on the time of year, but You do get a lot of really nice features, and I think my recommendation is again, if you're upgrading from an older Olympus, even an EM10 Mark II or Mark III, this is a nice upgrade if you want to stay very small, compact, and lightweight. And this is certainly an excellent upgrade if you have a much older Olympus camera, maybe the Mark Is or one of the 12 megapixel Olympuses. So I can highly recommend this camera for those types of buyers. I'd also recommend this even as a first camera because of all the features that you get with it. And if you don't mind spending a little bit more and you like these features, this would make an excellent first camera as well. The only type of buyer I wouldn't recommend this camera to is really professionals that need some additional features, which we'll see on the EM1 series. So if you're a professional photographer, you're getting paid for your photography, this might make a nice backup camera, but I don't think it has the professional features that you might need if you're getting paid jobs or getting paid to do photography. So let's look at the EM1s. Now the EM1 Mark II was Olympus's flagship camera until this year when they released the Mark III. But you can still see it adds a ton of capability over the EM5 Mark III. We now have dual SD card slots. We have PC tethering capability, which means you can hook your camera up to a laptop, and it's really handy for controlling the camera in a studio environment. The Pro Capture buffer is deeper. We can do up to 60 frames per second full raw images versus the 30. We also have a better build quality. It's an all metal body camera, so it's going to be more durable, more rugged for professional use. And we certainly have much longer battery life. I would say it's at least twice as long as the EM5 Mark III. I don't know what the specs are exactly between the two, but I can tell you in practice, you're going to get double the battery life out of the EM1 Mark II because it's just a much bigger battery. And we also now have 3 custom modes on the dial instead of just one. And that makes a huge improvement in workflow in the field. So for me personally, I program custom 1 for my HDR bracketing shots, and then I program custom mode 2 dial for manual mode and flash, and then custom mode 3 I have set up for my normal preferred settings for normal photography. And when I'm in the field or on a job, I can quickly switch from my bracketing to my flash and then to my normal shot when I do my professional architectural photography, because I have to do that constantly, switch between those 3 modes. So having it directly on the mode dial makes a big difference. And then of course we have excellent ergonomics. Now, I have a whole video on the ergonomics of this camera compared to say another camera, the Panasonic S5, but I can tell you that they put a lot of thought into the ergonomics of this camera. And the main thing being is that the grip is much, much deeper than on the EM5. So you have a full grip. So just trust me that this camera feels really good in your hands. Now they've also added Cinema 4K, which we do have on the EM5, but now you have access to an OM log profile, which gives you a little flatter image for more grading possibilities in post when you're editing the video. And they also provide a Rec 709 LUT that you can download and just plug into your DaVinci Resolve or Adobe Premiere, and gives you really wonderful colors. There's also an optional vertical grip available for the camera. So if you like to get, if you need to switch from portrait mode to landscape mode, a vertical grip allows you to do that, which I don't have one because I don't do portraits, but for professional use, a lot of professional photographers like having the vertical grip. In addition to that, the vertical grip also allows you to add an additional battery to the camera for extended runtime. Now, because this camera came out in 2016, as we saw before, this one does not offer USB charging. So just keep a couple extra batteries, you'll be all right. But yeah, there's no USB charging. And it also uses an LCD EVF. And I kind of had mixed feelings about making this a negative, but ultimately I decided to make it a negative because really cameras should have an OLED display, and they do have very capable OLED displays for EVFs now. The reason Olympus did this was to keep the refresh rate very high. It'll do 120 frames per second in the EVF, so you get less lag time and much better performance in terms of doing sports action. So again, the thinking was for more professional use in sports action type settings. So they kept the LCD EVF for that higher refresh rate. Now, making a recommendation has gotten a little bit murkier on this camera because the price has come down so much. It's now priced the same brand new as the EM5 Mark III with all of these additional features that we looked at. You know, the dual SD card slots, the tethering, the build quality, the battery, etc. And really choosing between the EM5 Mark III and the EM1 Mark II comes down to basically ergonomics. If you want a small, lightweight camera that you can take with you without having to drag a camera bag with you and maybe put one or two lenses in your pocket, I think the EM5 Mark III might be a better deal or a better camera for you. The M1 Mark II, however, if you're going to be shooting professionally, definitely this is the camera you want. Or if you're a hardcore enthusiast and you want to use some of the pro glass lenses or the longer 100 to 400 telezoom, super telezoom lenses, this is a better choice for handling larger, more professional lenses. So just give that some thought. I mean, if I didn't shoot professionally, I'd probably go with the M5 Mark III myself. I wouldn't really need all of the features that we have on the M1 Mark II. But if you're, and I don't shoot super long telezooms either. But I do shoot professionally, and that's why I have this camera. The M1 Mark III is now Olympus's flagship camera, introduced earlier this year. And again, they've improved the IBIS, another full stop, so it's now 6.5 stops. I think it'll do 7.5 if you get a lens that has IBIS in it as well. They've also improved the face detect autofocusing system. And I can tell you it is definitely a lot better than it was on the M1 Mark II. The M1 Mark II, I'd say if the person's face got to like within 10% of the frame, it started to get a little bit iffy. The M1 Mark III, really, if you get down to about 1% of the frame, if the person's face is about 1% of the frame, then you start to get a little bit iffy. So to give you some perspective, I noticed around 3 to 5 meters, the M1 Mark II, you're pretty safe with a 25mm lens. With the EM1 Mark III, you can probably go almost 10 meters before you start to get a little bit iffy. So almost double the distance in terms of face detect. I'm normally not doing portraits where the person's face is only 1 or 10% of the frame anyway, but I just thought I'd give you some feel for the difference or the improvement in the Mark III. The Mark III also adds a joystick to the autofocusing on the back of the camera. So that's, I wasn't that big on it when I first got the camera, but it's growing on me. I really like being able to move the focus point now with the little joystick instead of using the D-pad like I used to. And then the high-res shot mode is handheld now. You don't have to put the camera on a tripod. The M1 Mark II had the tripod high-res shot mode, but the M1 Mark III can now do handheld high-res shot mode. And not only do you get the higher resolution of the high-res shot mode, but it also really makes a difference when you're out doing night photography. Being able, because when I do street photography and I go out at night, I can handhold the camera in high-res shot mode and get much lower noise, because what it does, high-res shot mode basically takes like 8 or 16 pictures and then stacks them together in camera. And that stacking process reduces noise on the image. So a 1600 ISO image will look just like, say, a 200 ISO image. So it's a pretty substantial difference. They've also added Live ND. So you can add an additional 5 stops of shutter to your camera. It's not a real ND filter built in like you see in some high-end video cameras. It does it digitally, so it's kind of a artificial intelligence type feature, but it does work, and I've gotten some really nice shots with it for waterfalls and things. I can hold the camera about 2 seconds, on average, pretty comfortably with this camera. Some people can claim they can hold 1 or 2 minutes, but me, I'm pretty reliable at 2, maybe 4 seconds with this camera. And if with a 5-stop ND filter, I can really smooth out the waterfalls and things. And then they've also added Starry Sky AF, and that works too really well. You just point the camera up at the sky on a clear night with stars, and it'll autofocus on the stars automatically. It's really amazing. Everyone else on the planet that doesn't have this camera, they have to do it manually. But this camera does it automatically now. And then it also has now 4 custom mode dials, not just 3, on the mode dial. So I've upgraded to this camera from my Mark II, and I find myself actually using all 4 modes now in my professional work. So I'll use the first 3 modes for my pro workflow, and then I'll use the last mode just for my normal photography. So it's helped me out a little bit. One more is more is better, right? And then this also adds USB-C charging and running the camera. So you can charge the camera with a USB-C power bank, PD compatible, or you can run the camera off a power bank, which is power delivery capable. I think it needs to be at least 60 watts. Olympus recommends the Anchor brand, which I've done a video on, and that's the one that I use. But people have told me they've bought some other brands that are 60-watt power delivery power bricks that work fine. But I just use the Anchor one recommended by Olympus. But you can't do both. You can't charge the battery and run the camera at the same time. You have to pick one if you're going to hook up the USB power bank. And now with a recent firmware update, we now have 4K 422 10-bit RAW output over the HDMI, which is a pretty substantial upgrade in video over the previous Mark II. So if you're into video, you understand what that means. I don't use 422 10-bit RAW video files in my professional work, but it is a new feature, so I had to list it as something that's not available on any other Olympus camera. Now, making a recommendation on this camera is actually a little bit easier than it was on the M1 Mark II. I would say if you're a professional photographer, I would not hesitate recommending this camera because of the professional features that we found on the Mark II, but the addition of the improved IBIS and the improved face detect and the extra custom mode on the mode dial, and of course the 4K 422 10-bit RAW output through HDMI, it has some substantial upgrades over the Mark II for professional users. And if you're an enthusiast or an experienced photographer, the additional features like the Starry Sky AF, the Live ND, the handheld high-res shot mode, these things will just make things easier for you. And you really appreciate them like I do, as an experienced photographer. I don't recommend this as a first camera, but I definitely recommend this as an upgrade to the M5 or below. No question. So even if you have the M5 Mark III, this camera is still a substantial upgrade over the M5 Mark III. So those are the 2 kinds of people I would recommend this to. Now, looking at the M1X, I wouldn't call this Olympus's flagship camera, but it may be their best camera because it's the most durable, most rugged camera. It's built for very harsh environments and has, top-notch weather sealing and durability. And, the integrated vertical grip, the ergonomics on it are perfect. Whether you're shooting in landscape mode or in portrait mode, the button layout is exactly the same. And they've also have an improved autofocusing system, meaning they've added some sort of artificial intelligence. So it'll track like planes and trains and birds and cars. So it has this like AI in it to track those things, and it's pretty impressive. It works really well. I mean, I only tried it like at a demo when I was at one of their shows, but I was impressed. It does work. And of course, with the integrated vertical grip, you're going to get dual batteries. So you have, virtually all day runtime on this camera. Uh, the only thing you really lose on this is really the Starry Sky AF. They may add it in firmware later, but it hasn't come yet after almost 2 years. So I wouldn't count on it. But that's the only thing you really lose with this camera in terms of features over the M1 Mark III. So this camera obviously is for wildlife shooters, sports action photographers. If you're going to be using long, heavy lenses like the 300 f4 Pro or maybe even the 150 to 400 that just came out, this camera makes handling those kinds of lenses much easier, and the ergonomics are excellent. It's also great for enthusiast photographers, that appreciate the double grip and all of the durability and functions that this camera has to offer. Yeah, it's a great camera. I don't recommend it for beginning photographers or even as an upgrade to any of the other cameras because it is so expensive. I mean, even the price has come down quite a bit. It's about $2,000 right now in December 2020, but it's still an expensive camera. So if you have an EM1 Mark II or Mark III, I wouldn't recommend upgrading to this unless you really are a sports action wildlife type photographer, hardcore most of the time. Now, one last thing I want to talk about is the price difference between the M1 Mark II and the M1 Mark III. Right now, the M1 Mark II in December 2020 is $900 brand new, and the EM1 Mark III is $1,400 brand new. And that's a $500 gap. And what does the M1 Mark III really offer over the M1 Mark II? Well, again, handheld high-res shot mode, live ND, Starry Sky AF, and USB-C charging and running of the camera. And on the M1 Mark II, with the $500 you save, you can buy a couple of extra batteries. So you don't need to do USB charging, right? You have a couple extra batteries. And the original batteries, they're $120 for two. And for high-res shot, you're not going to be able to do it handheld, but if you buy a tripod, you can do high-res shots with a tripod, $130. And the same thing for the Live ND. Now that you have a tripod, you can just buy a regular ND filter and do long exposure, just like you can on the M1 Mark III. So that said, though, it looks like you're saving a couple $100 and then getting virtually all the capability of the EM1 Mark III, save the Starry Sky AF. So you'll just have to manually focus on the M1 Mark II. And it's not that hard. With the magnify and live view boost, a little practice, you can focus on stars pretty easily. But I would argue that honestly, you're not really saving money here and getting all the capabilities of the M1 Mark III. Because all of these accessories I listed here, the batteries, the tripod, the ND filter, I recommend you get for any camera you buy, including the EM1 Mark III. So I think my recommendation from before about the EM1 Mark III still holds even when we do a comparison like this, because like I said, these are accessories you should buy for every camera when you get into photography. Now I do have other videos going into more detail about the difference, say, between the M5 Mark III and the M1 Mark II, or the M10 Mark II versus the M5 Mark III, and so on. But I really try to put all of the information to a very succinct way into this single video, so that if you're thinking about buying your first Olympus camera or you're thinking about upgrading your Olympus camera, you can find basically the key information you need to know right here. Now I will have links down below to all of the cameras and accessories I've mentioned, and I am an Amazon associate, so I'll earn a small fee on any qualifying purchases, but it does help to support the channel, and I really appreciate it. And if you like this video, consider subscribing to the channel. But either way, thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.